Well, good morning or afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to have a record webinar today. I'm looking at attendance right now, and we are at 685 attendees and counting. I think we had almost 1,500 registered. Please note, if any of you guys have trouble getting into the webinar, our license only allows 1,000 participants. The email that you got an hour ago, at the bottom of that email, there's a link where you can join a live stream through Vimeo. The password is on there, it's Tree Fund. So if somebody can't get into the room, you'll be able to join that way. Obviously, all of you guys that are listening to me are in, but you might have some friends that send you a text or an email. So I have 12 noon Central Standard Time, at least for here in the Central US. Good afternoon for some of you, good morning, and for some of you tomorrow, I think, as this webinar normally has people from around the globe. I would like to welcome you first on behalf of the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. My name is Bo Broadbeck. I'm an extension specialist in urban forestry here in Alabama. And we're excited to be hosting this webinar at Auburn University Extension. We are the outreach arms of Alabama A&M and Auburn University here in Alabama. We're excited to be hosting the webinar. And secondly, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Tree Fund. In the Tree Fund, we started this webinar series a few years ago to bring to you some of the emerging research that is being funded by the Tree Fund over the last few years. And so as researchers apply for grants, they conduct their research, and once they've had a chance to publish it, we ask them to come on to our webinar series and share some of those results so that you in the field can get a sense of some of the emerging research that Tree Fund is working on. Just to give you a little background on who the Tree Fund is and what the Tree Fund does. Tree Fund supports scientific discovery and the dissemination of new knowledge in the fields of arboriculture and urban forestry. And they do this in three specific ways. First and foremost, through grants of new research in applied urban forestry and arboriculture field. And what we mean by applied research is that is research that at the end of the project can be transferred into a usable product in many cases in the field. We also support scholarships for aspiring tree care professionals, and also education for K through 12 programs for the next generation of arborists that's coming up through the ranks. A good place to become familiar with the past research that Tree Fund has funded is to go through the research archives. If you go to treefund.org, click on research archives, and you can look at research that was funded since 2004 or presented in 2018 or 17. You can search by researcher name or topic, and it's a great place to kind of get a sense of what's going on in the field of research as far as that which is funded by Tree Fund. You can also take a look at the webinars and upcoming webinars that Tree Fund has done in partnership with us here at Auburn University, as well as some past ones with Utah State Extension. And you can see some of our upcoming webinars. We've got a great list from fighting microbes with microbes to protect our native trees, to enhancing tree health and water, to Brian Scherenbrock coming back and doing a second part of his soil assessment. And you can see a lot of those. And I will note that with the challenging times that we are all living through today with the global pandemic, and some of us may be spending time at home, maybe more time than we wish at home, Tree Fund and Auburn Extension are going to partner to bring an expanded list of webinars over the next 2 months. We realize that a lot of conferences have been canceled. I know I'm on the board of ISA Southern Chapter. We just canceled our April conference. And so we're going to bring more content to keep you up to date and also provide an opportunity to earn some CEUs. And then finally, don't forget Tree Fund when you're thinking about donations. I know now is a challenging time, but when you fund Tree Fund through a donation, which you can go to treefund.org and hit the donate now, you're really funding future research, which in a lot of cases ends up in the BMPs at ISA and in the ANSI A300 standards. So, remember tree fund in the future. And then finally, before I turn it over to Dr. Greg Dahle, a few housekeeping items to keep in mind. During today's webinar, we're going to hold questions to the end. There is a chat box that you will find at the bottom of your screen. You can go in, type questions. I will do my best to monitor those questions and bring those to Dr. Dahle's attention at the end of this webinar. As far as CEUs, we have ISA and SAF CEUs. For ISA, we are asking you to self-report your CEUs. At the end of Dr. Dahle's presentation, he will put up the ISA code. You can go to the Tree Fund webpage and go to the webinar tab, and you will see a place where you can print the self-reporting form so that you can put in the code and send that directly to ISA. For those needing SAF CEUs, I will send those in on your behalf after the webinar. With all that said, I would now like to introduce today's presenter. He's got quite a crowd. We're now at over 900 attendees. Dr. Dahle is an associate professor at West Virginia University, where he teaches courses in arboriculture and urban forestry. Greg's research lab utilizes a biomechanical approach to understand how trees grow and survive environmental loads, as well as a broad urban forest management issues. Greg has worked as a commercial and utility arborist and is an ISA board certified master arborist. Greg, thank you very much for being with us today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn the virtual floor over to you. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bo, and thanks everyone for joining us. And I also want to say thank you again, as Bo just pointed out. Thanks the Tree Fund for putting on these series. It's great, and it's awesome to hear that you're going to have an opportunity to participate in more of these type of series and ways to garner our CEUs. Like Bo, I've been on many a committee, and we're having to cancel things actually this week, one here locally. So thank you all for joining us from around the world, it looks like, and around the country and North America. And I'm going to get started on talking about why tree branches fail. More specific, I'm going to look at some biomechanics research that myself and primarily my graduate students have been doing on looking at the branch attachment zone. And I will just kind of get right into it. As I look at how trees grow and develop, I always try to look at why or what we have to do to try to help manage these trees over time. As I work with my students here at the WVU campus, and as we transitioned online, I'm doing more of this online presence, but we manage trees for a variety of reasons. Quite often, a lot of it is aesthetics reasons. Both of these two trees, or these collection of trees, whether it's a double allele along a street leading into a state park, or whether it's a nice pollarded allele here in Prague. We're managing for aesthetics because they bring beauty to the city, but also we're managing for all the ecosystem services that many of us are familiar with, whether it's providing the shade during the summer, providing wind block during the winter, even sound blocking, as well as sequestering carbon, cleaning the air, all those wonderful benefits. But in order to have trees last the lifespan that we were anticipating for them, whether we're planting them for 50, 100, 200 years, maintenance activities are required.
Dr. Dahle,
and here we're making a very large...
This is Rusty. I hate to interrupt, but could you make sure your screen is being shared, please?
I'm sorry. Oh. How's that, Rusty?
Thank you, sir.
I forgot to hit the share button. I got most of the way through. So what we were looking at is the aesthetics on these beautiful trees up here, and then we have some management activities. We're making a large cut on a tree that was not maintained earlier in its lifespan. Rather not see these large cuts, but we have this once in a while. And it's due, in this case, to probably limited activities when the tree was younger. Another example of a tree that has failed in a landscape is a tree that I was very familiar with. This is the front yard of the house I grew up in. And we have a tree that my father called out to have he noticed that the tip was dying back, some of the top of the tree, and we had a stem girdling root in here. And while the arborist was on site, he had mentioned to my dad that we have a red maple tree here with a lot of codominant branching situation. And that's really what I'm going to talk a lot about today is codominant branches. And he warned my dad that this was a tree waiting to fail. I believe my dad had told me about this after the fact. He thought that the arborist was just trying to up some extra sales by doing some management on this tree, but it turned out within a year, year and a half, the tree failed due to a small ice storm. About a quarter of an inch fell in the early spring, and that tree split right down the middle. And I will tell you from the shade benefit, coming summer, it was very hotter, much hotter, and that was my bedroom. So I felt instantly in my late teens what it felt like to lose a tree that was just coming to maturity as far as benefit cost analysis. If we look at some of the data out there, 20, 25 years after planting and maintenance, the tree starts paying us back as far as all the costs that have gone into the initial management, and we're now starting to get the dividends off that. This tree no longer provided that because it was removed actually by the end of that day, that photo that was taken. So we have management activities trying to help us to have long-term, but one of the stresses I use, or one of the things I stress with my students when I talk about management, is I like to talk about how we are arrogant as humans. We believe that we know better than the tree on how it should grow and develop, and we can debate how accurate that statement is. But I always argue with my students that they really want to make sure that the sum of the costs, which are some of those costs that we're looking at are the cost to buy and plant the tree, transplant the tree, but also the cost to the tree of it being transplanted, leaving a lot of its roots in its original growing location, and then having to put out new root systems after it's been put into its final growing location, but also the cost, the physiological cost of removing live tissue. As we remove that tissue, we are creating a wound in the tree. So it's important to realize that all those costs collectively better be lower than the sum of all the benefits that we feel that we're getting out of that tree. And if we're not receiving long-term benefits from all of our management activities, then probably our management activities are not going in the right direction. And so when we think about both long and short-term costs, I'm going to start on the right side of the screen. Dr. Rao, one of my former students, his mother was traveling through Europe. I think this was in Italy, and she snapped this photo and he showed it to me. I thought it was a perfect example of wonderful topiary. A, I like topiary work, but B, I think this demonstrates long-term vision, and that's what we have to have in while we're managing the urban landscape. Unlike Johnny Depp and Edward Scissorhands, we can't just do things very quickly and just instantaneously create a topiary, or more importantly, the desired canopy and crown structure that we want on our urban canopy. It takes 50 to 100 years to achieve something like this. And yes, most of us are not looking for that long-term topiary look, but even 50, 25 years, we have to be thinking about what we want for the long haul. And it doesn't mean that we can't think about the short term either. This is in my backyard planting a red bud, and within 2 years, that red bud and the associated dogwood planting next to it, we have the landscape's changing. So long term, we can actually have expectations on how we can benefit our landscape on the short term as well. So we got to think about our short term management plan as well as the long term. And so why are we managing our urban trees? In the forest, we don't have to do a lot of management unless we're really trying to develop a fast-growing tree so that we can harvest it for lumber. But the reasons why we're managing our open-grown trees so extensively rather than the way we have limited management on the forested trees is there's a major difference. In the urban setting, most of our trees are open grown and they have the ability to keep on growing, and the lower branches don't have the sun shading the shading from the sun that appears in a closed canopy situation. As we look at these beaches here in a forest, we see that this, especially this beach right here, we see no lower branches up to about maybe 15, 20 feet up. And that is because due to the shading of the lower branches from both the trees branches above and all the other associated tree branches, the side branches, the smaller lateral branches down low, tend to die and then eventually fall off. So the tree has natural shedding when it's grown in a forested situation. But in the open grown situation, there's plenty of sun coming down into the tree. So the lower branches tend not to get shaded as heavily, and they don't tend to die off as fast and fall off. And what this ends up happening is this can set up a major maintenance nightmare, such as that red maple outside the front yard of my house, where you can have lots of codominant branches. So management activities are trying to develop proper structure on a tree as it develops over a time period. And what we're really trying to do is prevent major failures. As we look at this series of photos, these are Bradford Pears. For many of us in North America, we realize Bradford Pears fall apart fairly easily due to codominant branches and poor branch attachment. But what we're trying to do is manage our properties so we don't have failures like this. No one wants the residents in their cities to wake up in the morning and see a large branch over their car causing damage. It's just a problem that we shouldn't have to deal with. And that's where we as managers come into play. So Bo said in the introduction, my research utilizes biomechanics philosophy of trying to look at bio and mechanics. So biomechanics can be broken up into two terms: biological growth and development, which many of us as natural resource managers understand to a great extent, and coupling that with engineering mechanical theory. And biomechanics can be broken up into two different philosophies that we use. One would be the statics approach, and the second one is the dynamics approach. And real quickly, I do the statics. A number of researchers also do static and dynamic. The static approach looks at just applied loads over time, such as gravity or ice or snow, or even a climber that's going to be on a tree for a while. Even fruit set. If you've grown apples and pears, you know that as they get heavy during the late summer, they start drooping, their branches could start drooping. So that would be a static load. Where a dynamic load would be a sudden wind load, a load that is ebbing and flowing, coming for a second and then going away, or for half a second or maybe a couple minutes. But it's instead of it is a short term. A dynamic is a short term loading, where a static is more of a long term, minutes, days, hours, versus just seconds and maybe up to a minute for a static. And for today's lecture discussion, we're going to be concentrating our time on codominant branches, but static failures can be in the tops of trees with ice storms, and they can also cause major damage to big branches, as we see in this torsional failure can't even remember what species of tree this was. So when we look at managing our trees in the urban environment, we're trying to find ways to use pruning to achieve the desired effect for the tree. And primarily for today's talk, it's going to be how do we prevent failures. And if we look historically, there's been many studies, or at least a number of studies out there that talk about the situation with codominant stems. If we go back to the ice storm that happened in my front yard with that red maple, that failed because of codominant branching. And codominant branching has been shown to be branches that do not have a branch union that is very strong. It's not as strong as a traditional branch union. And to slow down for a second, a traditional branch union would be something along the likes of what you see in this branch, where the smaller lateral branch is significantly smaller in size than the central main stem. So in this case, in this tree, both of these forks are about the same size in diameter. Even in this branch, this fork situation, those are about the same size in diameter. So those would be codominant stems, and both of these would be lateral branch attachments because they have a smaller aspect ratio, which we'll define in a couple seconds. But we know that codominant branches are more weakly attached than healthy lateral branches. And that weakness is even added to when we have included bark, such as this situation where the bark is growing against each other from both forks and they're actually pushing against each other, rather than when we see this stem bark ridge or bark branch ridge that we see up on top. If you're going to have a codominant branch situation, that's a much better fork. It's a more stable fork than that fork that has a included branch situation. And both Brian Kane and Tom Smiley have done some research with this, as well as Ed Gilman, and they've all shown that, again, traditional branch unions are much stronger. Interesting enough, Ed Gilman, when he was working down in Florida before he retired, he found that there was an inverse relationship between aspect ratio and strength. And he says that aspect ratio is an important component into understanding the strength of a branch attachment. So what is an aspect ratio? Aspect ratio can be defined fairly easily by looking at the branch diameter and dividing by the stem diameter. So in this case, this is really an ugly picture to try to look at aspect ratio, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that's a 2-inch branch and this is 6 inches. That would not be considered a codominant situation. But in this case, a 3-inch branch and a 4-inch branch growing in companion to each other, those would be above 0.75. Actually, this would be 3.5 inches, and this is 4 inches. You'd have that to be around a 0.85 aspect ratio. That would be considered to be a codominant branch. So anything, as Gilman found, anything that is above 75% would be what he thought to be codominant branches. And this was based on some of the research he did with one of his graduate students, I believe it was Nathan Eisner, back in 2000s. And they found in terms of hydraulic segmentation, so the amount of water that's moving up both forks, they became equal when we got to an aspect ratio of 75%. So what he's saying is the same amount of water is moving up this branch as is in that branch when the aspect ratio is greater than 75. And so he quantified that as a codominant situation. What I'm trying to do in my research lab is use more of a mechanical approach to understand forks and tree branching. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's webinar. So a couple months ago in January, I was visiting and giving a talk to the Indiana Arborist Association. And Lindsay Purcell had me in over there, and I saw him give a talk, and it reminded me of some of the work Brian Kane has done in the past. Just a few years ago, Brian Kane produced a publication where Brian found that aspect ratio is the strongest predictor of attachment strength. And we had a conversation with the audience in the room, and people were noting that a lot of people felt that branch angle, the angle at that branch is growing in relationship in the trunk, is a strong predictor, what they felt was a good predictor of branch strength. And inherently, I want to agree with that statement. But unfortunately, when I turn to the literature, maybe not unfortunately, but when I turn to the literature does not agree with that. The branch angle is a good predictor of branch strength. If we look at this is a pin oak tree outside my office on the WVU campus. We have very horizontally growing branches on this upright stem of this, and it's not uncommon in a pin oak to see those horizontal branches. And those are considered to be fairly strong as far as central leaders and as far as attachment strength. And Brian Kane, again, found that branch aspect ratio and not branch angle was an important factor. And even if you go down to Dr. Gilman's, if people are looking for things to do to learn about arboriculture, Gilman has a wonderful video series that's been available. Just type in Ed Gilman video series. This is a screen capture from module 10.4, where he's talking about malice, apple tree orchards. So looking at the apple orchard literature and looking at that industry, and even in their profession, apple orchards, people that grow trees professionally to make sure that they last the length of time they need to recoup and make good profit off these apples. They have found that the branch angle is not an important factor as well. So it's really aspect ratio that we as arborists and urban foresters should be looking at, and not attachment angle. So what is happening in the branch attachment, and why is we talk about the sum of all the benefits against all the costs when we're pruning trees? How are we using pruning and creating wounds, and how are we protecting trees? And how are we not causing damage? And the reason for this is when a branch naturally dies, and it's a small branch in comparison to the parent stem, the tree has what's considered a branch protection zone. And Dr. Gilman, again, in some of his research, and I think he was following up with other researchers, is looking at that branch protection zone right in here. And what he's saying is when you have a small branch in comparison to a larger central leader, you have a good branch protection zone that if the branch dies and breaks off, it will wall off and almost compartmentalize Alex Shigo's coated model, but slightly different, but it'll wall off the movement of decay into the central stem, which would be very problematic. But as Ed Gilman found, I think these are red maples, and only a year or two after the removal cuts that were put in place, when that removal cut is about the same size as the parent cut, what we see is decay is moving down, and this is in the same time period. Decay is moving down much further and almost into the central pith of the main stem. So what we're seeing is when you have a large aspect ratio, you have more likelihood that decay is going to move down, and you're going to have a more likelihood that the tree is going to have issues down the line. And so what we want to do is when we're pruning, we want to make small cuts on lower aspect ratios, and we'll be fine. And the reason why he found this is you have shorter vessels, you have this swirling, as Lev Yadun found, you have swirling of the vessels on top, and this branch protection zone is rich in starches, phenols, resins, and even terpenes, again, depending on the type of tree that you have. And all those are helping to retard the decay as it moves down. So my question from a research mechanical standpoint is there also anything happening in this branch protection zone, this branch collar that we call down on this side? Is there anything special happening there that helps mechanically support this branch attachment? So we're going to get to there in a second, but I want a couple more slides just so that we can look at the branch attachment and the fundamentals. I hope most people are familiar with Alex Shigo's model on tree development and branch development. And here he talks about how the branch attachment forms. And really this is what's forming is this branch protection zone underneath. And the dark wood here is the early growth for the branch, and the light colored wood is the slightly later growth, only slightly later though, growth of the trunk. And so what we see is an overlapping of branch wood with trunk wood. So branch wood first, then trunk wood. What's happening in the spring, as in right now in the Northern Hemisphere, the buds are starting to swell. As they swell, they produce growth hormones. Those growth hormones move back from the tip of the branch where the buds are just swelling, and they start causing radial elongation on that branch. And when we get the radial growth, the diameter growth, it grows, the branch goes out and around last year's trunk wood. And once it does that, and enough of those growth hormones build up in the trunk, then the trunk grows over that newly formed branch wood, and you get the overlaying of these branch tissues. This acts to do a number of things. It segments the branch off from the central trunk. So as Dr. Gilman was pointing out with his student, less water moves up the branch and more water is available for the tree higher up, for all the branches up high. It helps build this branch attachment zone that serves as a branch protection zone, this area right in here. And then also, I think it serves to create an extra support of wood here to shore up mechanically this whole branch attachment zone. And from a mechanical standpoint, a point of attachment is one of the weakest points for, or stress concentration point for branches or any type of structure that's built. Kevin Smith with the Forest Service did a really good job of showing this through some really detailed photography. What we see here, this is a lateral branch, and we can see this branch collar of the trunk wood that has grown over the branch. You can see how that whole trunk tissue is coating around that branch. And you don't see the branch wood that's formed underneath here, but you can see how the branch collar is formed. Where on a codominant branch situation, you don't have that overlapping. You have tissue coming down and you have tissue coming down. So you have two branches merging into one rather than one smaller branch joining with the second one. And that's really important. As we look at these two codominant branch situations, what's happening, what we see is we see essentially a wedge, and this is why codominant branches are so problematic long term, is you see a wedge coming down. The trunk here, or the branch here, is growing in this direction, and this branch is going in that direction. Every year, more and more wood's being pushed against each other, in essence, wedging this branch to the left, or to the right, and this branch to the left against each other, and basically forming the wedge that will cause one of these two branches to fail, if not both of them. During some loading event, or even sometimes, especially I've seen in Bradford Pears and even in red maples, can happen on a calm winter or a calm summer winter day or something to that extent. It doesn't always have to be during excessive loadings, and resulting in failures such as what we've already seen. So get into some of the research. What I wanted to do is I wanted to look at codominant branches and see how they carry loads differently, and see if they do indeed carry loads through the branch into the central leader in a different scenario, if there's a different way the loading occurs in lateral branches versus codominant branches. I wanted to we'll look at if there is a formal definition for aspect ratio. Brian Kane's seen about 0.7 for some mechanical studies. Ed Gilman, through hydraulic studies, water movement, looked at 0.75. I wanted to see if there was, in red maples and even in some of the oak trees, if there was another number, or if those numbers seem to hold true. And I want to see how indeed this might reduce structural stability of branches. So before you start a study, you turn and you look at the research that is available out there. Going to a ISA or a ISA function or a tree care or tree fund function like this can be helpful in that. Junkel out of Europe had found on a study that don't worry about the microfibril angle, but what he's finding is the stem wood has higher density and the branch wood has lower density. And density has been shown to be the higher the density of wood, the stiffer it is, and the overall it has more strength, as far as high density equals increased strength, where low density shows increased flexibility. So what Junkel was finding is that the branches were found to be flexible, where the central stem was found to be less flexible and tougher and stronger. And he also questioned whether or not this flexibility and ability for the lateral branch to form will help reduce the force transmission into the branch. So if it will help keep the load from moving into the central branch and maybe dampen it through a static load or dynamic loading trials. His work was very interesting. It only had 3 branches. It's hard to create a lot of data, a lot of meaningful applied science off 3 branches. So we kind of wanted to follow up on this and look at some more branches and see what we could find. So from a mechanical standpoint, because when we're talking about biomechanics, we spend a lot of time looking at growth and development. Now let's spend a little bit of time looking at mechanics. We have stress, strain, modulus of rupture, and modulus of elasticity. Let's just spend most of the time right now on these two, stress and strain. Stress is how much load it takes to cause a failure. So it's the load per unit area. If I'm standing on a platform and I'm 150 pounds and my feet equal about 1 square foot, I'm putting 150 pounds per square foot down onto the platform. If I lift up one of my feet and I reduce my area of impact to half a square foot, I've taken that and now we're at 300 pounds per square foot. I've reduced the amount of area that I'm applying the load, so I've actually increased the overall stress. So stress is a force applied over a full unit area. Strain is the change in length or the deformation of a material during loading. So as I put down 150 pounds per square foot, the stage is going to deform ever so slightly. But when I take up 1 foot and I'm doing the 300 pounds per square foot, that stage is going to deform even more so. It's going to bend a little bit. Strain is easiest in my mind to think about if you take a rubber band and stretch it. When you first have it, let's say it's 1 inch in length, but then when you stretch it, it becomes long and thin. It's stretched to 2 inches in length, and therefore the strain is going to be 100% because it's increased in size twice. Now, why do we care about strain in branches? Or in wood in general? Wood deforms ever so minutely. And I'm going to show you in a couple slides how we can measure that deformation. But indeed, when we bend a branch, it deforms ever so slightly. And that the measurement of deformation is a really good approximate to the, it goes hand in hand with the total amount of stress that's applied. The last slide, I didn't go into great details on the calculation that was up there. This is a snapshot of it, the stress calculation. I don't want to bore us all with heavy details, but in general, what we have is the force is on the top part of the equation, and the resistance to the force, the unit area, is on the bottom. And we have axial loading, we have bending loading, and I don't want to spend any details going into or time spending in the details other than this is force per unit area, and this is in bending, but it's force per unit area. It just has a different relation. This would be pi r squared, which is the area of a circle. This is the momentary resistance of that circle in bending. Without going into detail, it just takes radius and raises up to the fourth. We have a similar loading, which is P, and we have the length that the load is being applied on the branch, the moment arm that's being applied. We can use these calculations, and in fact, many of the researchers that I've pointed out before have looked at these, and I have as well. But when we have a branch that failed, if we look at the resistance on both of these, the r squared here and r to the fourth, that's talking about taking the radius. Well, we can take the diameter of that branch and take the radius. But if the failure is in here, what's the geometric shape that is resisting the failure? Is it the radius from the pith out to there? But how do we go down here? Where do we stop? And if we look at this Bradford pear, what's the geometric shape of resistance that the light colored wood in that failure? How do we define that? R doesn't define in there. It's very difficult. So the stress calculation is a wonderful way of understanding the breaking stress on something when it's a uniform shape where it fails. But if it's an irregular shape, it's less available. It's very difficult to do this. So what we've decided to do in my lab is look at a strain calculation, the deformation, because deformation and overall stress, it deforms in relationship, in a positive linear relationship, not one-to-one, but a linear relationship between stress and strain. So I'm going to need to move ahead quickly because I'm taking a while, but we're taking some information that some software and the camera equipment that we're introduced to from Matt Millis, a NASA researcher in the Cleveland area, which is using the stereophotography system that can calculate strain by looking at the distance between all these black dots, and it measures the distance from that dot to that dot. And as we strain and pull this and bend, you can see that all 4 of these dots have all moved in relationship with each other, and the distance between here to here, as we deform it, has changed in size. And so the computer can calculate that as we go through. and it can calculate the deformation, which is relation to the stress and strain. So our pull tests, we are pulling branches apart and looking at the strain and inferring how the load is moving as we pull down on this branch. We're looking at how the load is moving from this branch through the branch attachment zone and into the central trunk. And as we look at this schematic, a video of the tree being pulled, this is a red maple, some early trials. Anywhere that is black or darker blue is where we have increased strain. So indeed, we have high strain here where the failure occurred because there was a dead knot, but we strain coming in and not going very far into the central trunk. Red means that there's virtually no strain, and blue means that there's higher strains. And we're seeing strain does not move too far into the central trunk. It's kind of sequestering itself. It's being dampened, dare I say, in the branch attachment zone. So that was just a couple trials, and then we decided we're going to go ahead and run a bunch of experiments. So we looked at 2 different experiments that I'm going to talk about quickly today. And the first one was looking at some oak trees, some chestnut oaks and some white oaks, where the aspect ratio was less than 0.5. So where this side branch, this lateral branch, is at least half the size of the parent branch. And then we're going to run a study afterwards, and we're going to look at red maples, where this lateral branch goes from 0.5 almost up to a 1-to-1 ratio, where it's clearly a codominant branch. We're going to look at the strain in this area, and we're going to see how strain pattern is different between a lateral branch and in a codominant branch, and try to see if we can find any similarities and differences. So we're going to model tensile strain, and what we're going to see is we're going to see tension on top, which is stretching of the tissue. And we're going to see compression on the bottom, which is it's going to be pushed together. So when we pull down, we're going to have compression on the bottom and tension on the top. So we ran a whole bunch of samples, and we analyzed the results. We're in the process of writing this up. And what we found was on the lateral branches, where the aspect ratio is less than 0.5, so this side branch was less than half the size of the parent branch. The loading was concentrated in the branch right at the connection point and in that branch collar, and a little bit lower. So every letter, if the letter is the same in that region, that means it has the same deformation, or in case the same loading. So A's are highest, B's are next, and C's are the lowest amount of tissue deformation. So the branch protection zone, as Gilman defined it, had a medium amount, and by the time you get into the central branch itself, there was much less loading, or deformation. So loading is primarily in the branch collar, in the branch, and then the branch attachment zone, and then less by far loading in the main branch area. But on the right side, we have a codominant branch situation. And what we see now is the loading is coming much farther down, still in that area of branch collar, but it has moved into the branch attachment zone, and even to some extent into the central branch. And the central branch is almost as much as the branch itself. And then the parent stem has by far less. But the loading is not concentrating up here and here. It's actually coming down further into the parent branch. So we have a good degree of difference in the way loading is moving into the parent branch and the way it's moving beyond the branch collar. We then looked at how aspect ratio has a relationship with the strain of the maximum strain. And what we see is a parabolic equation here, and we see it is decreasing with increasing aspect ratio until we get to about 0.78 or 0.77. That is when the aspect ratio is now flattened out, which fits in line with somewhere close to what Gilman found from a hydraulic standpoint, 0.75, a little bit longer than what Brian Kane found with mechanics of his 0.7. But I think what's safe to say is by the time we get to an aspect ratio of 0.7 to 0.75, we are clearly in a codominant situation that is inherently weaker. So what we want to do is go ahead and prune and maintain trees so that they have a much higher aspect ratio, 0.6 and even lower, I said higher, I meant lower, so that we're going to be less likely to have this inherently weak aspect ratio of 0.75 and higher. We're going to skip, we measured angles measurements, and I'm going to skip this area real quick and just reach off into the findings. We found strain propagates further into the stem during loading of codominant branches. We found about 0.75 or so from mechanical perspective is when we think, at least in the red maples, when we are going to see for sure a codominant branch. But I would argue that we want to use pruning to make sure that we don't approach that 0.7. We stay lower, 0.6, 0.5 on that aspect ratio. And how would we do that? I would argue we turn towards more subordination pruning and try to slow down the aspect or the growth of a branch that's growing too fast. If this is a branch we want to retain long-term and it's becoming close to a codominant branch, we'd want to use a reduction pruning and subordination pruning with reduction cut to slow it down so that the diameter of this branch does not grow as fast as the diameter of the central trunk. So we'll be less likely to have a codominant situation in the future. I would also, at that same Indiana Arborist Association meeting, I met with John Ball, one of the gurus for safety in arboriculture. We were chatting, and he's seeing a preponderance of climbers tying their climbing ropes out on branches rather than in the old days we were taught to climb around the central trunk and use that branch as the holding point. But now they're actually climbing on the branch itself. And his thought is because of the aspect ratio and inability to see the top of a branch, this data might actually help convince us to tie around the central trunk even more. So if you're an arborist, I would suggest maybe tying onto the central trunk. And if you are an urban forester and you have arborists working for you, share this information. Safety is important. That's why we're all sequestering ourselves. But even when we get back to work, being safe is always the first and foremost. I have a couple minutes left. I want to thank all the students. This was primarily Rob Eckenrode's research, his master's thesis, but I have Dave DeValence working with us as well as Tom Smiley. Well, this was not funded by the Tree Fund. It was set up from a grant from the Tree Fund, both through biocompliance. John Goodfellow had a grant that worked with some of my my digital photography system, as well as another grant I'm going to look at really quickly, which set the ground rules for how I'm using this this equipment now. So this data was not directly Tree Fund, but it was led into from 2 Tree Fund grants. And I want to just spend a quick second. The last Tree Fund that I did that used, the first one that used the stereo equipment, we looked at static tests on whole trees to take a look at loading. And I'm just going to look really quickly. What we did is we pulled, now let's just go backwards. We pulled branches or whole trees and we looked at the loading by pulling in one direction. We look at how much load went from the central trunk into the roots and into the leeward roots, the windward roots, and then a tangential root. And what we found is leeward and windward, in the direction of the pull, had the same amount of strain and only half as much strain went into the side roots. Which was not necessarily earth-shattering, but what we did come to the conclusion on this one is while strain is equal on the leeward and windward side, the torsion side, the tangential side, had much less. So what we're suggesting that you should do is stick to your current ideas, but you may want to take into account the direction of loading. If you have a predominant wind and that's about all you have, if you're in the urban canyons, city, Oslo or something like that, where you have a wind always coming in one direction, you want to be extra careful not to hurt the leeward and windward roots because they are really receiving much of that loading. And this was funded from the Tree Fund, as well as NIFA, the WVU University, and also Morton Arboretum. Jacob Missbauer helped out with the study and loaned us a lot of equipment. So I want to thank him for this.